Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. Scientists have issued their starkest warning yet.
It feels like this week was when it changed for Britain. Just 7 days ago, life was almost normal.
To unleash the full power of the federal government in this effort today, I am officially declaring a national emergency.
Well, hi there, partner. The more I write about Red Dead Redemption 2, the more I have to say about it, that amount increasing exponentially with every sentence I force from my brain through the keyboard and onto my computer screen. I think it is Rockstar's most serious game, both in terms of its subject matter and the amount of time it spends, or rather doesn't spend, on the goofier characters and subplots that were my least favourite parts of the other games in the Rockstar stable. And this contributes directly towards how much I enjoy spending time with the game itself, doing not very much really. Even in the quieter moments, hunting rabbits and the elusive badgers through the dense undergrowth for no real reason other than that I've bought so totally into the fiction of the world Red Dead 2 creates. The game is thick and dense with meaning that I haven't experienced before, even in my forever games like Bioshock and Dark Souls. Every encounter that I've had with the game has been different, despite the fact that I play my Arthur pretty much the same way each time. I know that I shouldn't, I know that I really am only seeing half of the Red Dead 2 experience by doing this, missing all of the darker sides of the game that are waiting to be enjoyed if the player decides that Arthur is a victim of his circumstances, but one whom will be damned if he isn't going to make everyone else victims as much as he is. On second playthroughs of the really big games, I do try to come with a different approach to roleplay as much as possible, but Red Dead 2 is different somehow. I'll try to explain this in the video, but I already feel that I will fail. The game is so big and my vocabulary so limited that I feel I will fail to do the game any justice at all. Still, I shall try in my own small way. Red Dead 2 is about endings, which is odd because at its most basic level it is a prequel, the first part of a story that ended almost a decade ago with 2010's Red Dead Redemption. In many ways the story itself isn't new at all and can be viewed as merely a vehicle for getting all of the various characters of the first Red Dead game into their places where that game starts off. For the main characters of Red Dead 1, protagonists and antagonists both, Red Dead 2 is backstory, lore, the prequel trilogy to Red Dead's classic trilogy, to use a Star Wars metaphor. We already knew that the Van der Linde gang had collapsed in Red Dead 1. Red Dead 2 shows us how its disintegration came about. Arthur isn't in Red Dead 1, so it doesn't take too much sleuthing to deduce what happens to him in Red Dead 2, even if the exact manner of his exit comes as a surprise. It is interesting to note how Red Dead 2's status as a prequel nevertheless highlights how much motion it contains going into and out of the main story itself, and just how much it is still about endings thematically, if not quite dramatically, despite only representing half of a story. Actually, even less than half a story, given that it doesn't show us how the gang came together in the first place. We begin in medias res. The gang has sought shelter in a storm high up in the mountains after a botched raid on a ferry out of Blackwater, in which a number of their members have died. The gang is in a state of flux from the beginning, on the back foot, on the run, and they never really shake the feeling that they could be discovered at any moment, even during the game's halcyon period for the gang, the sunny, summery uplands of their time at Horseshoe Overlook. These sparse moments aside, we meet the Van der Linde gang at the beginning of their own disparate ends. This sense of inevitability builds and builds throughout the first two-thirds of the game, before being sealed and confirmed with Arthur's diagnosis of tuberculosis. He caught it after beating a man to death, a man who owed the gang money, actions that the player and Arthur only learn about hours of playtime later, but which they will deal with together for the remainder of the game. Much later in the game, Arthur comes across the debtor's widow turned to prostitution to pay the bills, and her son working a dangerous job down the mines. My Arthur had long known of his fate by this point, had had the chance to see the consequences of his actions, and had a choice in front of him. Did he try to make amends, or did he wash his hands? My Arthur tried to make amends. However the player chooses to handle Arthur in the various and myriad ways and options open to them in the 100 hours of playtime before, there are still points of Arthur's life that are set in stone. He still beats the man for money, hell, he beats a lot of men for money. That's just how the world works. Men borrow, some men owe, still fewer find no way of repaying it. It's not his fault, it's just the way of the world. It's man unleashed, he says. Unleash goodness, says Mrs. Downs, or leave us alone. My Arthur tried to unleash the goodness, in his own way. He stopped Mrs. Downs' son being bullied by the mine foreman. My Arthur saved Mrs. Downs from a nasty trick and gave her family money to get as far away from the lives they had forced them into in the first place. Later debt collecting jobs give Arthur the choice of absolving debts, where that very choice wasn't even a consideration from the younger, angrier Arthur. One such debtor died by working himself into an early grave trying to pay off Strauss's debts. When Arthur goes to meet his widow, she asks what more they can give that has not been already taken. My Arthur forgave the debt and gave some money to the widow and her son. It's not like he needed it anyway. It's also the last straw for Arthur. He confronts Strauss at the gang's last camp, Beaver Hollow, though it is nothing of the warmth and joy that suffused their home at Horseshoe Overlook. The old Arthur would probably have killed Strauss, though the new Arthur admits that he probably should. He packs up Strauss's things, throws some money to the floor and tells him to get a job. So many people have been stripped of their chances in life by Strauss's usuring. Arthur, the Downs family, the Londonderrys, but the cycle is broken here. Strauss at least has an opportunity to make amends for his deeds. He can make the choice to make amends for what he has done. It was a choice that my Arthur made, but one made against a clock that ticked much louder than Strauss's ever would. Arthur will always beat Thomas Downs, he will always contract tuberculosis, he will always die with dawn's first blushes creeping over the sweeping American West. These points are fixed, immutable, but there are numerous tiny different details in the game's story and the way that the characters interact with each other that change depending on what sort of man the player thinks Arthur is. At a number of points, usually after particularly momentous story beats and events, cutscenes play and feature a particular animal prominently. In my first playthrough, that animal was a stag, a proud, noble, peaceful creature, living off the land, shy of human contact, happy to live and let live. And I took these images as representative of the land, an ideal of the American West that was gradually disappearing, being replaced by what Arthur would refer to in hushed tones as civilization. As much ciphers for this idealised representation of that nowhere land as Arthur is himself a cipher for a set of ideals, values and customs that were heading towards the same extinction. In researching this video, however, I found that these cutscenes change depending on exactly what sort of man the player decides Arthur is. Play Arthur ugly enough, mean enough, selfish enough, and that animal becomes a coyote, crouching low on the horizon in the driving rain, alone, waiting for its next kill. I said a little while ago that regardless of Arthur's choices, he will still die on that cold mountain. This is only partially true, the manner of his death changing depending on how Arthur conducted himself in his life. If he has pursued redemption and helps John and his family to escape, he lets the tuberculosis take him, a peaceful acceptance of what he has long known was coming. If he has pursued greed and his own selfish needs, Micah shoots Arthur. If he turns his back on John and goes back for the gang's money for himself, Arthur succumbs either to a stab wound and the tuberculosis or Micah kills him outright. All of these endings are governed by the honour system that awards or deducts points based on the decisions Arthur makes. Rob a store, you lose some honour. Going back for the money in the game's last level, that'll lose you a whole lot of honour. Helping around the camp or saving John's family in the final mission conversely awards the player honour. The whole system is incredibly well handled and avoids the sense of, and this will make my friend smile here, gaminess that such systems can produce. I'll try to skirt around my TED talk on gaminess as much as possible, but gaminess is the inescapable feeling that you are operating within, interacting with video game systems, both technical and design, rather than any, for want of a better word, realistic dynamic game world. Different games are guilty to greater or lesser extent of tendencies towards gaminess, but the best example I can give is Bioshock Infinite, where the disconnect between this ostensibly complex, detailed story and characters and the staged, gamey nature of the level design is distracting to the point that now I really struggle to enjoy the game with nearly the same unreserved joy that I experienced when it was released in 2013. Maybe I'll make a video about it one day. Anyhow, Red Dead 2 rarely, if ever, in fact, falls victim to gaminess. I bet there's a proper word for this feeling out there somewhere, and I think this is largely because the game rarely ever sets any of its decisions in front of you in any explicit way, and certainly not in any binary good choice, bad choice dichotomy that games from previous generations are guilty of. The decisions being made cease to be ones within the confines of a computer screen, the confines of a digital world, and make the leap to ones being made inside the player's mind. You certainly can hold up shops and steal all their money, but there is never anything so bold as a button prompt reminding you that the option is there. The game never tells you that the clan is very much a presence in the world and that maybe their ideas are kinda gross and disgusting and that maybe someone should do something about it. I'm not even sure that the clan are referenced explicitly at all, but maybe Arthur is out riding one night and he sees some light in the woods and maybe he goes to check it out. Who knows what could happen next. The game painstakingly lays out the tools, arguably perhaps too painstakingly, for the player and trusts them to take them up should they wish. The shooting tutorial was likely hours away in the game's story, but players never forget to press the L trigger to raise their gun. Part of the reason this leap from the digital to the wetware, so to speak, of the player's brain is so successful is down to just how goddamn beautiful this game is. And I don't just mean beautiful as in how Red Dead Redemption 2 looks. I know miles of digital ink has been spilled extolling the fidelity of the Rage engine, but if I can allow myself a moment of the internet's cyber airtime, Red Dead 2 is a superlative smorgasbord of delight for the eyes, a beautiful, ugly, harsh, windswept, sun-dappled, crocodile-infested, badger-ridden, but somehow never when I actually need a badger, slice of silicon ambrosia. Writing about how this game looks must be somewhat akin to writing about how Crysis looked way back in 2007, as in there are not enough words, too little time. Perhaps only poetry could begin to hint at grasping towards the idea of a soupçon of a sliver of the beauty that Rockstar has squeezed from Rage. Red Dead 2 is an astounding collision of technology and art which has not been seen before or very likely will be replicated again. But that is for the conclusion, and this is all on the PC. The fact that the same effect, or close to the same effect, could be wrung from the already dated hardware of the Xbox and PlayStation will never cease to amaze me. And ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent back to Earth. Please make sure your armrests and tray tables are stored safely. Red Dead 2 is not only beautiful in terms of all the delicious eye candy, it's in how it presents its underlying values and attitudes to the West, the frontier life in general, and America ultimately. But I have to concede here that that feeling in me is as much down to the way my Arthur approached the world and the way that I approached the game as it is to any diegetic, artistic decisions made by the developers. And to explain this, I have to expand the scope of this video briefly and talk about, quote, what a Rockstar game is, and that is violent, narcissistic, nihilistic. The GTA series is still the flagship franchise in the Rockstar stable, and for me at least, those games are almost uniformly cruel, harsh, misanthropic beasts with very little time for empathy or pathos. Sure, the games are full of characters in all manner of flavours, but I never liked any of them, save perhaps Nico maybe, but I don't really think Rockstar wants you to like them. The GTA games are snapshots of the modern world pushed to the breaking edge of believability and then pushing just a tiny bit more until the stitches are beginning to rip from the fabric. They are satires, they satirise us as consumers, as players, they satirise media. Everything is a joke told through a lip-curling sneer, from the streets of Liberty City to the rolling hills of San Andreas, along the rivers and canals of Vice City, before finally down the dusty highways outside of Los Santos. Does the GTA franchise hate everything it portrays? No doubt the developers would argue that they are loving portrayals of a landscape and lifestyle with which they are intimately familiar, having grown up with and absorbed the cultural touchstones that the series habitually returns to all their lives. Hate is a big word, certainly one too large for this little video of mine, but I wouldn't leave it too far behind on the notepaper. Where the Grand Theft Auto games have been parodies, the Red Dead Redemption series I feel have always been quieter, slower, brooding works that focus on the quiet spaces in relationships in the landscape. This might be down to the time period that these games have adopted. The late 19th and early 20th century vistas and rhythms of life in the American West do not map neatly onto the noise and fuss of late 20th and early 21st century America, no matter how many myopic It's GTA with Horses comparisons that are somewhat patronisingly bestowed on articles about the Red Dead series. I don't know if documentary is the right word, but I basically jizzed myself a few paragraphs back talking about Red Dead 2's graphics engine, so in for a penny, in for a pound, I guess. It's probably about as close as we're ever going to get to experiencing what life was like at the end of the 19th century, which is probably for the best, what with all the tuberculosis and really people kind of smelled great and the Wi-Fi coverage is rubbish as well. Grand Theft Auto has always been about parody. Red Dead has always been about realism, and these very deliberate design choices have a very real impact on the tones that each is going for, which itself is tied to the period of American history that they are portraying. Grand Theft Auto has always concerned itself with a modern America at the height of its powers, and sought to tear it down in its own small way. Red Dead has always been about an America, or at least a version of America, that has ended, or is ending. This is partly the reason for the somewhat clickbaity title of this video. In so many ways, Red Dead 2 is about endings. The end of the Van der Linde gang, the end of Arthur's story in particular, but these are mere ciphers for a broader narrative, the end of the outlaw lifestyle, the end of the cowboy, so vigorously embodied by Arthur, the coming of the city, electricity, and the beginnings of, as Arthur puts it, civilization. These themes weave and thread their way throughout the narrative, indeed it is impossible to extricate them, one cannot be made sense of without the others. The game opens with the Van der Linde gang in full flight from the Pinkertons, losing their pursuers in the wilderness of Red Dead's equivalent of the Rockies. Their first proper encampment at Horseshoe Overlook, with its pleasant vistas and dappled woods, is quickly replaced as the gang are driven south, and crucially east. The east is viewed with suspicion by most all the characters you come across in Red Dead 2, and this sense of the east as being some sort of disruptive force manifests itself as the gang flees further and further towards the city of Saint Denis, the closest real-world approximation being New Orleans. Even the geography of the area shares similarities. Horseshoe Overlook is replaced by Clemens Point, which is replaced by an encampment just beyond the city limits of Saint Denis itself, before the game resolves itself at Beaver Hollow, crouched in the bleak foothills to the north of Saint Denis, but still farther east than any of the other camps in the game. Of course, there is the chapter on the island of Guam, an odd sojourn that feels more and more like the developers failing to have faith in their audience and the slow pace of the narrative's development, but that is for another video. The Guam chapter is odd and dumb, a mechanical novelty rather than any narrative tool. You could remove it and still retain narrative consistency, and every time I come to it I roll my eyes and grit my teeth, much like turning a page in Game of Thrones and realising that the next chapter is a Sansa one. The Van der Linde gang are not just trying to outrun the Pinkertons, but society and civilization itself. Throughout the story, Dutch is constantly reassuring the gang that he's got a plan. He is less and less convincing as the story develops, his own character flaws magnified as the gang's situation gets more and more dire. Dutch is a tough man, but loyal, and he genuinely seems to have the gang's best interests at heart. But you can only evade change for a time. You can never escape it. Dutch's world, the Old West, where a man could live by his wits and in certain circumstances his revolver, is gone, replaced with the New West with its polite society. It won't take him quietly though. He kills those who wrong him in fits of reckless pique, disregarding totally the protestations of those around him. He shoots Leviticus Cornwall in cold blood and drowns Angelo Bronte before feeding him to an alligator. As in the last days of Rome, where the fights in the Colosseum grew wilder and more chaotic as the barbarians grew closer, so with Dutch van der Linde. As the 20th century crept inexorably closer, so he leant further and further away and into the ways of the Old West. Arthur can go two ways. He was practically raised by Dutch, idolising him as a father figure. At the beginning of the game, Arthur is Dutch's lieutenant, enforcer, confidant. Their relationship changes as the game progresses, but how far it changes is up to the player. When it came to my Arthur's final moments with Dutch, the two couldn't be more different. My Arthur had chosen a possible future for John and Abigail over a potential present for himself loaded with what was left of the gang's money, albeit a present rooted firmly in the past. He had chosen to offer a future for a lot of people by this point, in fact, the chance for a new life in a new world. He saves Jamie Linton from a rash act, he puts Penelope Braithwaite and Beau Gray on a stagecoach to Boston. He never killed unless he was given no other choice, and took no joy in it when he did. My Arthur in many ways is what Dutch should have been. Was it the tuberculosis that saved Arthur's soul, if not his body? I think not. The rot had set in with Dutch long before John ever laid a finger on Thomas Downs, and I don't feel like he could have rode the trails he'd rode and walked the streets he'd walked in this new America without letting just a bit of it in along with the tuberculosis. Perhaps in this one way Arthur is most in contrast with Dutch at the end of the game. He is at peace. No more running. "We're thieves," he once said to Dutch long ago in the summer days of this game's long meander to those last few moments on the mountain, in a world that don't want us no more. Arthur knew that it was over long before the writing had even begun being daubed in the bloodiest red ink on the wall. Dutch was always running. In Arthur's last moments he chooses to run again, and even at the very end of Red Dead 2's languorous epilogue, he still chooses to run, down a path that'll run for another 12 years before finally ending at that cliff edge in 1911, where he finally admits that "our time has passed, John." He won't bow to any government justice, however. Dutch has always lived by Dutch's rules, and he dies by his rules, and it seems fitting that it is one of the rules of nature, a nature that he has so fiercely stood by that aids him in drawing a line under the blood-soaked chapter of Old West history that is Dutch van der Linde. At the end of Red Dead 2, the cowboy is gone. Interestingly, Sadie Adler, the woman the gang discovers in the game's snowy opening, arguably takes on the mantle of the archetypal gunslinger in the epilogue to the game, but with her distinctive duster coat and shotgun, she seems even more of an anachronism than Dutch and Arthur did. The old gangs are gone too, destroyed or gradually dissolved as the whispered civilization quietly and determinedly spread west. Colm O'Driscoll is long dead, and the rest of his gang are destroyed by Sadie and John in the epilogue. Arthur kills the leader of the Lemoyne Raiders for a bounty, and the rest of the raiders are destroyed in one of the main storyline missions. My Arthur looted the hideout of the Murphy brood while he was out and about one day, and they made the sorry mistake of presuming to rob him. As for the Van der Linde gang, well, theirs is a more slow acceptance of progress and change rather than the violent eruptions visited upon the other gangs. Arthur is dead. John, Abigail and Jack have gone to find their own way. Micah is killed in the climactic moments of the entire epilogue by John and Sadie. As for the lady herself, after her spell as a bounty hunter and gunslinger for hire, she travels to South America. Charles goes to Canada to start a family. Reverend Swanson moves to New York. Mr. Pearson is shown running the Rhodes General Store while the credits roll. Mary Beth is now an author. Despite his acceptance of new ways of living, despite his acceptance that the old ways have ended, the past will still hound John Marston to his final moments outside the barn on his own land, bought fair and square and abiding by all of the rules of the New West that nevertheless stood against him on that sunny day in 1911. The epilogue is vast, perhaps 12 hours or so in length depending on how you play it, a languorous, peaceful moment, made all the more poignant when you consider that it is indeed one of the last moments of true peace in John's hard life. 8 years have passed since Arthur's death, and the Marstons are passing through Strawberry seeking honest work and an escape from a misunderstanding in Roanoke Ridge that resulted in John shooting a man. John takes a job as a ranch hand, but even after 8 years, trouble still seems to manage to find the man no matter how much he flees it. One morning, Abigail and Jack have left, Abigail fearing that John will never be able to leave his old life and past well behind them, where it belongs. John is able to borrow money from the ranch owner and buys his farm up at Beecher's Hope. The scene where John is able to finally complete the paperwork is one of the most memorable for me. The clerk fusses with rollers and stamps and signatures, and John's eyes move between each as the bankman does his work. Finally, he presents the bill of sale to John. "Now we own you, Mr. Marston," he says, "and we own your property, but you can buy your freedom each week. Eventually, you will be a homeowner. Congratulations," he continues as he hands the paper over. "You are now a real American." The contrast could not be starker from when we first met John in the Grizzlies, bloody and shivering, a wanted man, an outlaw who couldn't look more than a few days ahead of himself at any given moment. In some ways, the title is a misnomer. It should be Red Dead Redemptions. Arthur redeems himself by giving John and Abigail the chance at a new life, but he could never enjoy it with them. His time was long past even in the sunlit days of Horseshoe Overlook. John redeems himself by honouring Arthur's sacrifice and recognising the ways he has failed Abigail and Jack. He wasn't too late when he signed away his freedom and became a real American, as the bank clerk in Blackwater calls it, but he was damn close. Rockstar games never truly end, not really. The player are able to stretch the playing time long after the characters have completed their arcs and all of the scripted missions are done. For me, the ending of Red Dead Redemption 2 is the last moments when John and Abigail are standing on a little cliff overlooking their farm, their own slice of America that they fought to carve out. The pair are bickering the same they ever had, Abigail nagging John to do right by Jack, and John being crotchety and sarcastic back. They are standing exactly where they are buried at the end of Red Dead 1, together forever overlooking their little piece of America. In all of my playthroughs, I stop at this moment and start again, going all the way back to 1899. John and Abigail deserve their moment of peace, and I choose to give it to them by forever leaving them standing over Beecher's Hope, the slow sun sliding down the late summer sky. Red Dead Redemption 2 was released on the 26th of October 2018 on PlayStation and Xbox, and November the 5th, 2019 on PC, which was the correct decision. Red Dead 2 on the PC is objectively the true Red Dead 2 experience. In the first 3 days of release, Red Dead 2 made $725 million, which was the second largest opening weekend in the history of all entertainment. All of it. Titanic, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, books and movies. Only Grand Theft Auto 5 has done more opening business than Red Dead 2 did. 17 million copies of Red Dead 2 were shipped within the first 2 weeks, outstripping the lifetime sales of Red Dead 1 in that time frame. As of February 2020, 29 million copies of Red Dead 2 have been sold. It has won 25 industry-recognised accolades, including 6 Game of the Year awards. It has an average of 96% on Metacritic. Assuming that each copy of the game retailed at around $60, a rough calculation would find that total sales revenue for Red Dead Redemption 2 sits at around $1.74 billion by the end of February 2020. Gosh, those are a lot of numbers. And for all my lyrical waxing about the game's beauty and craftsmanship in terms of the world and characters, and various and numerous sources discussing Red Dead 2 as a piece of art, ultimately the game is a commercial property that was created to make money. And it succeeded, as all those numbers will prove to you. The thing with talking about Red Dead 2 in these terms, and this applies to all such large artistic endeavours, but particularly to video games, is that it obscures the human costs of creating them. A book or painting is made by one artist, a song might be made by a handful, movies are made by hundreds, but video games are made by tens of hundreds, even thousands of people working together towards one artistic vision. And it is the cost to these people that is rarely ever talked about, but with Red Dead 2 that conversation began to start happening on a greater and more open scale. Crunch is of course what I am talking about. Crunch is a point in a game's development when the team are seen to be failing to meet particular production milestones, and often a development team goes into crunch in the months running up to a game's release. The video game industry is incredibly competitive, and as such it can be incredibly difficult to resist being forced into these crunch periods when you know that there are 10 people queuing up behind you to take your place if you can't do the time. The development team may or may not be incentivized to go into crunch. Some companies offer food, some companies offer time off once the game is delivered in lieu of the crunch time worked. Some more might offer bonuses or promotions based on delivery milestones achieved. Of course, there are some companies that do not offer such incentives. In the United States, some developers are classed as exempt non-hourly paid professionals, which means that they are not eligible to claim overtime. If your team goes into crunch, you either work for free or you are reminded where the door is. A 2004 study by the International Game Developers Association found that 97% of respondents worked overtime, and that over half of those had not been compensated for their time. Rockstar are a video game developer operating within the industry in the early 21st century, and they are no different when it comes to crunch time and their working practices. A Kotaku article references the development of GTA 5. In documents detailing working hours, employees who had failed to work 60 hours in any given week were marked with "under" in red ink next to their names. One employee at Rockstar San Diego recalls a period when overtime wasn't optional. It was mandatory 80 hours for basically the whole studio, said one person who was there. If you don't have any work to do on Red Dead 2, just test GTA 5 for another 8 hours. That is 11 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months. For some, Red Dead 2's crunch period started in 2016, 2 years before the game was released. For some, it never happened at all. The development period started in 2011 or thereabouts, so it took a decade to bring to computer screens. But there are some in the industry that don't think that even with this vast yawning chasm of time for development and polishing and all that great stuff, a game like Red Dead Redemption 2 could ever be made without crunch. An example of the same Kotaku article cites is the name of Red Dead 2's largest city. It was originally going to be called New Bordeaux, but when they discovered that Mafia 3's own open world city was going to have that name, Rockstar changed it to Saint Denis, which meant hours and hours of re-recording the dialogue, changing the map, signposting game, anything that verbally or visually referred to New Bordeaux. And these decisions can be made at almost any point in the game's development cycle. There are some parts of the game that can't be done until another part has been completed. Dialogue can't be recorded until the script is completed, for instance, and scripts are subject to constant tiny rewrites running up to as close to the release date as you can imagine getting without having to delay for even longer, and Red Dead 2 was delayed 6 months in the first place. Crunch isn't going away. A game I am very much looking forward to and very nervous about is CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077, which coincidentally was also delayed for 6 months recently. Even with this extra time, the company's chief executive has admitted that there will still need to be crunch to get over the line. Doom Eternal has been in crunch for pretty much all of last year, and no prizes for guessing, that was delayed as well. Crunch is a fact of life for video game developers. I wanted to end this video by asking whether among all of its multitudes of endings, Red Dead Redemption 2 would also signal the end of crunch in games development. I think not. The industry is more open about crunch, but really it only gives them opportunity to admit to something that has been endemic in the industry from the beginning, while also allowing them the opportunity to seem sympathetic to the artists that work and break their bodies to bring their art to people like you and me. Really, we are the problem. You and I are so demanding when it comes to our games, and really, we are probably the people least well placed to know whether those demands are reasonable or even practical within the time frames that we have come to expect. We expect more, bigger, larger game worlds, more choice, increasingly nuanced ways in which the games react and adapt to the player's presence and actions within them, and that needs time. Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't the last word in open world gaming. It's the new bar beyond which new games have to strive. I think people are more accepting of delays personally. Who can really say that Fallout 76 wouldn't have been a better product if Bethesda had given themselves another year to work on it? Delays are opportunities for the developers to hone their product and hopefully ease up on their staff. Reading around the subject of crunch, I'm not so sure that this is the case. I've had the credits rolling for Red Dead 2 for this section. All of these people gave a little bit of their lives so that you and I could experience this game at the height of what it was possible to achieve. Red Dead 2 was the end of a production cycle and a serious chunk of some people's lives, and no doubt the new cycle has started perhaps more than 2 years ago. GTA 6 will no doubt be another entertainment milestone. Who knows what beginnings and endings it will usher in, but it will take a lot to do it as gracefully and poignantly as Red Dead 2.